Labdien, Henrija Makgī. Esmu ļoti priecīga šodien jūs visus redzēt. Mans vārds ir Zane, tie, kas varbūt mani vēl nezina. Un es gribu teikt, es jau pie pirmās izjūtas vēlos teikt un aplaudēt Ingai, jo viņa īstenībā ir tas labais vaininieks, kas ir visu šo iesācis, visas šīs idejas, iniciatīvas, labais gariņš, kas ir, es gribētu mazliet turpināt uz priekšu, lai mēs vairāk un vairāk domātu, runātu un darītu ilgtspējīgas mērķu sasniegšanas labā.
Mēs esam kopš 19. gada kopā Latvijas Muzeju Biedrība nosauktā UNESCO Nacionālā komisija, bet arī vēl nepieminētais partneris Latvijas Bibliotekāru Biedrība, Latvijas Valsts strādājuši, lai runātu par ilgtspējīgu attīstību un atmiņas institūcijām. Un esam sākuši tādām lielākām plašākām tēmām, skaidrojot to, kas ir ilgtspējīga attīstība, ilgtspējīgas attīstības mērķi, kā tas attiecas kultūras institūcijām, atmiņas institūcijām to darbu. Un visu šo ceļu mēs esam veikuši un tiešām no pašiem sākumiem kopā ar Henriju Makgī, mūsu uzticamo konsultantu, skolotāju, varētu teikt, muzeja speciālistu. Un šodien ar šo ceļojumu arī turpinām un no tādām plašākām tēmām virzāmies uz jau konkrētākām. Runāsim par šobrīd ļoti aktuālu tēmu, katastrofu riski, kā tos mazināt, kā tos pārvaldīt. Un šķiet, ka šī tematiskā izvēle bija ļoti dabiska tieši šogad, pēc pandēmijas un karam sākoties, un muzejs īstenoja Rokasgrāmatas sēriju Muzeja mieram, un ļoti loģiski šķita, ka nākamais tulkojums ilgtspējīgas attīstības mērķu tematikā ir tieši katastrofas un riski. Un tādā veidā mēs visu šo gadu veltām šai tēmai. Ceram, ka mūsu saražotie podkasti, publikācijas, arī šis seminārs būs mums noderīgi.
Jā, un pirms ievadvārdus vienkārši vēlos pateikt, ka tiešām tas, ko mēs šodien runāsim, ļoti saskan arī pat kā no Eiropas muzeja konferencē izskanējušajām tēmām par to, kā muzeja vispār atmiņu institūcijas spēja tikt galā ar savu risku un savu kļūdu apzināšanu. Un, lai pēc iespējas labāk sagatavotu šos plānus, lai pēc iespējas labāk reaģētu dažādās krīzes situācijās. Un šī diena ir kā tāds ļoti labs turpinājums vismaz man, bet es ļoti ceru, ka arī pilnīgi jums visiem.
Latvijas dalība UNESCO vienmēr kopš iestāšanās šajā starptautiskajā organizācijā, starp citu kā vienā no pirmajām pēc valstiskās neatkarības atjaunošanas, ir bijis ļoti nozīmīgs mūsu starptautiskās aktivitātes virzienas kultūras jomā. Tajā darbojoties esam gan daudz guvuši, gan daudz devuši, jo īpaši nemateriālā kultūras mantojuma saglabāšanas un aizsardzības jomā. Pasaules kultūras un dabas mantojuma konvencija, kuras 50 gadzīti pasauli šogad svin, ir UNESCO konvencijas stūrakmens. Pievienojoties tai, mēs esam apņēmušies glabāt mūsu visu, proti visas cilvēks radītās kultūras pēc un zemeslodes un sargāt mūsu kā kultūras nāciju nākotni. UNESCO plašais ietvars padara mūs ne tikai par Latvijas, bet arī par visas pasaules kultūras mantojuma mantiniekiem un sargiem. Šodienas mobilitāte un tehnoloģija radītās iespējas gan mums katram šo mantojumu izzināt, izbaudīt, ar to lepoties visā tā bagātībā un daudzveidībā, bet vienlaikus, kā UNESCO un šīs konvencijas dalībvalstī, arī atbildīgi rūpēties un stāvēt sardzē par to, kā vienotam spēkam. Šodienas parādzēs bīstamā pasaule liek mums mainīt akcentus, prioritizēt uzdevumus un koncentrēt spēkus virzienos, kuri vēl nesenā pagātnē šķita vairāk teorētiski, nepraktiski risinām un aktuāli jautājumi. Klimata izmaiņas, pandēmija, bet jo īpaši Krievijas agresīvais karš un izrādītā necilvēcība, nežēlīgi iznīcinot Ukrainas zemi, cilvēks un arī šīs zemes kultūras mantojumu, kā Ukraiņu identitātes nozīmīga daļa, liek pasaulē aktīvi rīkoties, jo tas ir mūsu visu kopīgs mantojums, kas iet bojā Ukrainā. Ir ciniski, ka Krievija to nevēlas uztvert kā tādu tik acīm redzamajā kopīgas vērtības nozīmē un neapzinās to, ka barbariski iznīcinot Ukraiņu kultūras mantojumu tā iznīcina arī savas saknes un cilvēcību, kas ir ikvienas kultūras dziļākais kodols. Kā to uzsver šīs UNESCO nedēļas devīzes, pēdējo gadu radīties atvesinē pasaulē liek mums visiem, un jo īpaši kultūras mantojuma jomā strādājošiem, būt radošākiem, stiprākiem un cilvēcīgākiem. Latvijas muzejnieki un citu Latvijas institūciju darbinieki tādi arī ir radoši, cilvēcīgi, stipri, bet tas nenozīmē, ka šīs spējas nebūtu vēl jākāpina, jātīsta un jānostiprina. To uzsver arī paši UNESCO uzstādījums nākamajiem 50 gadiem, uzturēt un īstenot pasaules mantojuma konvenciju, kā izturēt spējas, cilvēcības un inovācijas savot. Ja agrāk lielāks akcents tika likts uz radošumu, tad tagad priekšplānā neapšaubām izvirzās drošība un spēja darboties krīzes apstākļos. Neviens vien valsts kultūras nozarē šajos gados katastrofu, risku, mazināšana un pārvaldību no formāla dokumenta nosaukumi ir pārtapusi par jēgpilnu diskusiju, tēmu, nozares profesionāļu vidū. Par to liecina tādi šī gada notikumi, kā Starptautiskā zilā vēro prezidenta vizīte Latvijā un Latvijas Nacionālās bibliotēkas rīkotā konferences kultūras mantojuma aizsardzību un glabāšanu krīzes situācijās un katastrofu risku pārvaldību bibliotekās, arhīvos un muzejos. Pasaules mantojuma konvencija un ar to saistītās aktivitātes ir ļoti nozīmīgs balsts, kas mūsu valstī līdzīgi kā dalība NATO liek kultūras jomā būt vienotiem, kā pasaules kopīgam spēkam, stājoties pretī šodienas izaicinājumiem, agresoriem, mantojuma postītājiem, apturot necilvēcību, kas negaidītu un grūti aptveram atklājas savu baisamīgo seju 21. gadsimtā. Darba, krīzes pārvarēšanā un katastrofu risku mazināšanā mums visiem ir ļoti, ļoti daudz. UNESCO nedēļa ir vērtīgs ieguldījums, atgādinājums par mūsu tiesībām un par mūsu pienākumiem. Šis dienas seminārs un Rokasgrāmata ir pašā laikā, un tas būs nopietnis, reāls ieguldījums Latvijas Muzeju darbinieku rīcības spējas celšanā. Lai veiksmīgi tā norise, lai visiem dalībniekiem jaunas atziņas un spēks tālākā cīņā ar šī sarežģītā laikmeta izaicinājumu.
Labrīt, man viņa tiešām brīnišķīgs rīks un sirsnīgi pateicība. Patiesi mājas un attēks pirmkārtām un visiem jums, kas šodien esiet kopā ar mums, lai mēs pievērstu savus acis un domas par to, kā tiešām būt radošākiem, spēcīgākiem un cilvēcīgākiem, sargājot, labājot un tālāk nododot mūsu mantojumu. Kad Kanādas Nacionālās komisijas vadītājiem uzdeva to jautājumu, bet sakiet, kāda tad ir loma kultūrai pie ilgtspējīgās attīstības. Dareiz nav tāda atsevišķa mērķa. Viņš teica ārkārtīgi vienkārši. Iedomājieties, jebkuru mērķi bez kultūras, un jūs sapratīsiet, ka tā mērķa īstenošana ir bezjēdzīga. Jo proti kultūra ir tā, kas patiesi iedod šo cilvēcību, iedod šo virsību, iedod pārliecību, ka tas, ko mēs darām, tam ir liela un nozīmīga jēga. Un Latvija šajā gadījumā ir izcila valsts, jo šeit doma par to, kā kultūra veidot kopā ar pārējo vidi, ar sabiedrību, ar ekonomiku, nāk ne tikai no valdības vai no kādiem ārpus valsts esošiem kā organizācijām, kā UNESCO, bet idejas dzimst uz vietas. Un patiesi domājot par to, kā lokalizēt, kā strādāt ar ilgtspējīgās attīstības mērķiem, ir dzimuši vairāki stāsti, starp kuriem patiesi ir jāpievien bibliotekā ar Biedrības muzeju, Biedrības kopīgi veidotā konference, kur Latvija startēja kā jau Baltijas mēroga koordinators, kā pēc tam sekos šobrīd turpinājot šim projektam, iesaistot arī Moldovu un Grūziju. Vasarā tika sarūpēts, un pat arī Meksikā man bija ļoti liels prieks arī dzirdēt ļoti labas atsauksmes par ANO līmeņa pasākumu, kas atkal un atkal rādīja, kultūru siet kopā ar šo cilvēcību radošumu un spēku. Proti, mums ir ļoti daudz darāmā, un tajā pašā laikā mums ir brīnišķīgas iestrādes. Un šobrīd klāt tam, ko mēs esam darījuši līdz šim, runājot par vidi, par ekonomiku, par sabiedrību, tiešām nāk šie izaicinājumi, kas ir saistīti ne tikai ar pandēmiju un atpūšanos pēc Covid, bet tiešām ar patiesām šausmām, ar kara apstākļiem, ar spēju nostāties pret tumsu un gaidot šo gaismu un mieru cilvēku prātos. Tā ir ārkārtīgi liels izaicinājums visiem, kas strādā ar sabiedrību, un šajā gadījumā muzeji, bibliotekas, atmiņu institūcijas ir tās, kas palīdz no vienas puses saskatīt šo cilvēcību nākotni, un no otras puses nepieļaut tās kļūdas, kuras varbūt kādreiz ir tikušas pieļautas. Un novēlot jums visiem ļoti veiksmīgu darbu, es vēlos, protams, arī šajā brīdī vērsties pie Henrija Makgī. Henrija, I address you. My colleagues, you have very many positions, of course, you are very famous, not only in Latvia, but also in all other countries. But today I would like to say that you are our godfather localizing our sustainable development goals in Latvia. And as such a very nice title for you, I would like to present you our Latvian ABC. Because Latvia is somehow very related to UNESCO, so we move up our nation on three pillars: education, science, and culture. And those three pillars are Latvian culture, ABC is in this book. So I present, and the name of we are launching your book here, I present you this book. So and thank you for being with us, and I wish every success to you and every success for everyone here.
Augstgadātais ministri kungs, cienījamās dāmas, godātie kungi, kolēģi un draugi. Man ir patiešām nedaudz prieks jūs redzēt šodien šeit, Rīgas Vēstures un Pētniecības muzejā. Un man līdzīgi, ka Zane bija sagatavota sava runa, taču pēc izsmeļošanās un brīnišķīgās ministri kunga runas, pēc Baiba Moļņikas runas man patiesībā trūkst vārdu, ja jūs pateicāt visu tieši to, kas ir jāpasaka īstajā vietā un laikā. Es tikai kā muzeja praktiķis varu izbaudīt to brīdi, kad mēs šodien šeit visi esam kopā ar brīnišķīgo Henriju Makgī, un varam apgūt tās lietas praktiski, kas mums noderēs šobrīd, nākotnē, un tādā veidā mēs visi kopā varam darīt visu, lai šo situāciju, šo krīzi mazinātu. Tā kā paldies par to, ko jūs darāt. Paldies visiem un novēlu mums brīnišķīgu šo dienu.
So nice to be here. I've been to this museum in the past just to visit as a tourist. And it's really great to be here in Latvia because I've been... Okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. So it's great to be here because I've been collaborating with Latvian Museums Association, Libraries Association for 3 years now after the NEMO conference, the last NEMO conference, the one in Tartu. And of course the NEMO conference has just finished in Portugal. And really it's been very wonderful to work so closely with Inga and Zane on different initiatives, because sustainable development it's the way I describe it, it's like it's a mindset and it's a muscle. And like any muscle, the more we use it, the stronger the muscle gets. And so it's been really great for us all to strengthen our sustainable development mindsets and our muscles, because we need to develop them together. Because what culture tells us is that none of us can do this stuff on our own. You know, no person lives isolated from others. How we are in the world is the work of culture. And it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the British Council and to the UNESCO Latvian Commission and to the Libraries Association and the Museums Association for allowing me to be here, for the great privilege that I have to talk to you for the next 45 minutes or so. And so what I'm going to do is to talk about the relationship between three different things. Between peace, and sustainable development and disaster risk reduction. And because we have quite a lot of time together, if you have questions or anything strikes a chord or anything you don't agree with, because that's also completely fine, we can, you have time to talk about that with one another over the next few hours. So what I'm going to talk about really is about culture for long-lasting peace. And I'll talk a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals because because I use them so much. So what is it that we mean by peace? To talk about human rights and rights-based approaches and how they relate to sustainable development, and to talk about disaster risk reduction. And to say that today it's wonderful as well to be here because today is International Disaster Risk Reduction Day. And so it's great for us to have the chance to have a workshop, which is how we strengthen our collective muscle, our knowledge, our skills, our confidence, our ability to work together with this as an idea. And so here's a great quote that was done from Mami Mizuturi for today. So that we need end-to-end and people-centered systems which will stop the spiral of disaster reduction and contribute to a more sustainable, more resilient and more equitable future. And as we'll see as we go through the presentation, these are great words. There are many great words, but how do we make them reality? And that is where I think the place of institutions like this come in. Where can people find out things? Where can people have the chance to agree, disagree, explore what these kind of ideas mean, share their own ideas, because we definitely need them as well. Just how can we bring all of this work to life? And so over the last couple of years, one of the ways I work is that I write a series of guides on sustainable development topics that are free to help people get started. And then if they want some more help or want to work more closely with me, that's my job. That's what I do. And so I'll talk today in relation to three of these topics. Sustainable Development Goals, disaster risk reduction, and also human rights. And as Zane mentioned, as Inga mentioned, we've already translated one of these guides, thanks to Zane a couple of years ago. But today we launched the one on disaster risk reduction. And if I can explain that I wrote those two, the human rights one and the disaster risk reduction one, in 2020, in view of the pandemic, because there's a great risk that as institutions come out of the pandemic, they make decisions that might be useful in the short term, but are actually very bad in the long term. So we need to help people make good decisions. And I wrote the human rights one because human rights are a great basis for our decision making, a really fantastic one, as I'll talk about later. And just to say, if people at the back, if you're unable to read the words on the screen, of course we'll send round the presentation afterwards, and you can use that. But of course, one of the organisations who have helped me be here today is the British Council, which is the UK's cultural relations agency. And it has an initiative called People-to-People Relations. And I like to think in terms of concepts. So what do we mean, people-to-people relations? We might think about people as individuals, as communities, as different cultures, but we can also think about how the organisations, including museums and libraries, play a role in these relations. What is their role, either as a kind of conductor or as trying to get people to do things? We'll return to that. And also as a kind of stepping stone between the work of governments. And so I think there's something has happened here. Excuse me. Something's happened here. Oh, you can't see it. It's asking me to accept something. Eisvert. Does that accept?
It's charging off. Okay. We will fix that.
Okay. So we'll find a plug. So here is a great an argument for peace from UNESCO, that peace should never be taken for granted. It's an ongoing process, a long-term goal which requires constant engineering, vigilance, and active participation by all individuals. It is a choice to be made on each situation, an everyday life decision to engage in sincere dialogue with other individuals and communities, whether they live a block or a click away. And so again, I'll introduce a number of these kind of ideas, and what I'd encourage you all to do is to think, well, how can museums and libraries and other kinds of institutions, what is their role in helping this to happen? And how can we make sure that it's done in the right way? And so as we talk about conflict, we can also think about, well, what kind of conflict is it that we are talking about? We can say that there are 3 kinds of conflict and 3 kinds of peace. And there are also 3 kinds of peace building, how we build that peace. So the first one is the easiest one to spot, direct conflict, which we might think most obviously about violence or fighting or wars or oppression, as we see with Russia and Ukraine, but also environmental destruction. The next one is more difficult to spot because it's kind of built into the fabric of our society, structural conflict. How is it that different institutions cause either oppression or people are unable to live in harmony? What are the structures in society and the institutions, the policies and the decisions that keep that alive, to be honest? And the third one is cultural conflict. How can we think about different aspects of culture that cause either direct or structural conflict? Cultural conflict often just comes around when groups of people are unable to understand one another, when they do not share either the same values or they're just unable to understand one another's point of view. But we can say in relation to these 3 kinds of conflict that there are the 3 types of peace. So firstly, it's a slightly strange name, it's called negative peace. It means the absence of violence. And it's supported by something called negative peace building. It's a slightly strange word. The second one is called positive peace. How we change our policies and the institutions and the structures so that they support peace more effectively. And the third one has the strangest name. It's called just peace. Just in the sense of like injustice. It's about ensuring that peace is something that everyone enjoys and everyone can take part in. And so it is really built by everyone having a concern for one another, respect for one another, also having respect for oneself. Thank you very much. I'm glad that's sorted, that's great. And basically how we can ensure that people have concern for one another and respect for one another, and respecting also, as in through the work of UNESCO, that people are different. And that difference cannot necessarily always be a threat, but how can we accept difference within a common framework of trying to live together? And so just as I said, there are 3 kinds of conflict or 3 kinds of violence, 3 kinds of peace. There are also 3 kinds of peace building. So the first one is called negative peace building, preventing war. Positive peace building around changing the structures, as I mentioned. And the third one we can think of as culture-based peace building. But what does this mean, and how can we think about the role of the cultural sector in this to make sure that people have what we would call agency, that people are able to make decisions, determine their own future, and so on. And I've got a great big list here of, just to highlight, there are many, many ways to promote cultural peace building. I'll just read through them just to get through it. Reconciliation, promoting community dialogue, strengthening civil society and ensuring that civil society represents a range of different viewpoints, increasing human rights for everyone, promoting environmental awareness, empowering women and girls, building bridges between communities, which is of course so important as we see in this current time, and promoting economic development, but economic development in a way that supports these other things. So promoting economic development that works for everyone, that everyone can benefit from, that helps to protect the environment and contribute to a thriving society. And so I'm going to go through these three different aspects: human rights, sustainable development, and disaster risk reduction, to kind of show that they're kind of like three sides of the same triangle. So we can think about using human rights in a very practical way, and all I'm trying to do today is to talk about tools that are things that we might think are a good thing, but we often don't use. So human rights we can use in a very fundamental and very profound way. So cultural institutions relate to many human rights agreements, what we call conventions or treaties, but also human rights can be used as a guide for museums and libraries to think about, well, what kind of services should we develop, who are they for, who should benefit, and why are we doing them in the first place? And the third part, the human rights-based approach, gives us the how to do it. It gives us a way to ensure that we're not just trying to make people to be in a particular shape, that we respect that people have rights and they should have an opportunity to contribute to all of these things. This, of course, goes to very fundamental considerations. We could look from the Latvian Constitution about respect, universal respect for human dignity and freedom, recognizing, protecting fundamental human rights and respecting ethnic minorities. And as I mentioned, that cultural institutions relate to many human rights. That if we work with human rights, we should be specific. So which rights is it that we are talking about? Because, as I say, we can use these in a very practical way. So there is the right to education, freedom of expression, and the right to information, which means the right to correct information, helping people to understand how to spot good quality information and when they might be being lied to for different reasons, that we have the right to participate in public affairs and also the right to participate in cultural life. But also, cultural institutions are related to all other rights. Just as we find with sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals, these things are all connected. Of course, museums, libraries, cultural institutions, they also support, they impact on people's employment rights, their civil and political rights. They can support their right to health and so on. So these things are all very connected. And what I'm trying to say here is that cultural institutions have these kind of strengths, they're kind of superpowers, if you think about it that way, which are these kind of rights, which are so obviously related to their work, that can help other people, understand their own rights and fulfill them. And so within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now over 70 years old, it talks about this particular right, and I just want to go through it in quite specifically, that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And it could be worth us spending a bit of time later to think about, well, what does this mean on a day-to-day practical basis? How much is this the world we live in? Or what can we do to make it the world we live in? What are the opportunities of fantastic museums such as this to make this a reality? And again, very helpfully, this has been broken down that everyone has the right to take part in cultural practices, cultural activities. Everyone has the right to know their own culture and that of other people. And everyone has the right to contribute to the cultural life of the community. not just in terms of here or in cultural institutions, but how can we encourage, how can we empower everyone to have a stake in society, that they are valued, that they trust what other people, other communities, what is happening, and how can places like this help this to happen. Peace is built one action at a time, one day at a time. It is nurtured, it is grown, that in the same way that health is more than the absence of illness, peace is more than the absence of war. So how do we use a place like this to really help peace be a rich, diverse, representative, meaningful aspect of all of our lives? And so the Universal Declaration is quite old. It was put together after the horrors of the Second World War, and there have, of course, been many developments since. And some of these are extremely useful for the cultural sector. So one is called the Right to Development, which came from 1986, which is so useful because it gives us a great definition of, well, what is meant by development and how should people be involved in this. So it says that development is about individual people and on their own and in association with others. But it also says that everyone has a responsibility for this, for the progressive improvement of their community, society. And the most useful bit is this last bit about people should be involved through this thing called active, free and meaningful participation and sharing the benefits of that. So if we think about that in a relation to a museum or a library, well, what would active, free and meaningful participation mean? How can we make sure that people aren't just, they don't just come and look at things? How are they involved? How are they able to share their views with one another? How can we ask questions and give people opportunities to share their answers so that people can be part of a community? And building on this, we have something called the human rights-based approach, which, it has to be said, is a great thing, but is not really how we think. It's not really how we work in most of our institutions. We think that the institutions are kind of right, and they can kind of solve people's problems in different ways. Schools solve people's lack of education. Gyms solve people's lack of fitness. But what is it museums and libraries solve? So that's often not so clear. But this thing called the human rights-based approach is to say that people they don't just receive what the institutions give, because the institutions might also be a bit wrong. Let's be honest about that. That if the institutions don't know what people want, need, what they hope for the future, then they'll never be able to provide a good service. So the human rights-based approach is about helping people to have a voice, but also that helps the institutions to be more effective, if this makes sense. And cultural institutions can be an absolutely brilliant opportunity for this, because they can help people share their opinions just about, well, what would they like their community to be like in the future? And then we can look at, well, how can we use cultural heritage in this discussion, if this makes sense. So the human rights-based approach, we can use it like this. As I mentioned before, it's always really helpful if you're talking about rights to be really, really specific. Which rights are you talking about? Whose rights? Who are the people who get them, and who are the people who don't? What is preventing people from receiving them in society, but also what is preventing the institution from completing its duties? And then we can come up with activities to help bridge this difference. And the human rights-based approach helps us get away from the old-fashioned idea that the people are somehow kind of victims, or they need to be solved somehow by the cultural institutions or other institutions. It also helps take some of the pressure off of cultural and other institutions, because you don't need to be saviors or heroes or any of these things. You just need to help people share their views and with one another, if this makes sense. I hope this makes sense. And I know I'm going quite fast, but hopefully some of the ideas will be useful to have some discussion afterwards. And so, as I mentioned, these are all really great. I think they are really, really great things, but they are not really how our society often works. And so I'll move to talk now about sustainable development, the second of these three things I'll talk about. That you are, I know in Latvia, you are, of all countries, very familiar with museums, libraries, and the SDGs, because it's Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs as we call them for short, because you've been working with them quite a lot, and this has been wonderful. But just to say a few things about them that people perhaps don't always think of. They're often familiar with the 17 goals, but that's just a picture. Or they might be familiar with the document on the left, Transforming Our World, but that's just a document. These are just words on the page. They have to be brought to life. Where can we bring them to life? And two things I'll mention. So one of the principles of the agenda is called Leave No One Behind. It's the idea that everyone should be able to participate in this agenda. And so this, of course, can be the work of cultural institutions, not just to say that governments have agreed this, so cultural sector should do this, and because that's not quite right. Because the other thing to mention is that in many ways, the agenda is not a new thing. It is a new way to achieve many things that are not happening. So for the last 70 or so years, governments have made decisions on behalf of society. Sometimes they happen, let's face it, sometimes they don't. There are lots of conventions and agreements, but almost nobody knows about them. And this is a very big problem, and it's a big problem for democracy, because if people don't know their rights, they will never get them. But the problem is that the agreements and the conventions and the treaties, they can be quite boring to read, they can seem quite complicated, and there are so many of them. So over the last 70 or so years, we have many human rights conventions, we have the 6 culture conventions, we have the World Heritage Convention, we have about 500 environmental agreements. No one is going to ever be able to read all of these things. And so the agenda was put together in 2015 as a relatively simple way to cover all of these existing things, achieving all of these human rights agreements, protecting helping complete all of these environmental agreements through quite a simple thing. I know it might seem complicated, 17 goals, but that's a lot simpler than the other, all of these huge piles of documents. And the goals also do a very clever thing, that they help us break through the different silos of different sectors. So rather than the cultural sector having to go to the business sector or the academic sector and explain what it does and what its plans are and what its strategies are and what its rules are, because that's really complicated, you can just say, well, here's a set of goals. Which goals are you trying to achieve? And then if you were in a room of people from different sectors and you said, well, who's interested in addressing poverty? People would put their hand up. And you think, okay, let's work together. We can work out the how afterwards, if this makes sense, rather than us start from our rules and our procedures and our plans, because that doesn't achieve always very much. And so I'll talk a little bit about what the agenda is trying to achieve. There's the document, Transforming Our World. There are the 17 goals. How can we understand this in the kind of bigger picture? And really the agenda is quite simple. It tries to achieve 5 things: to end poverty and to ensure that everyone can live in dignity. This is the people aspect. To protect the planet for current and future generations, the planet aspect. To ensure that everyone can lead a prosperous and a fulfilling life in harmony with nature. This is prosperity. To foster peaceful and tolerant societies, and to achieve all of this through partnership, because it's only by working in different ways with different people, different organizations, that we create different results. And so this is very clever. It takes the old three aspects of sustainability, social, environmental, and economic, and it makes them easier to remember because it's 5 Ps, and it adds on these two things, peace and partnership. And when this was put together in 2015, what it says in the agenda is there can be no peace without sustainable development, and no sustainable development without peace. And this is truer today, that we see this more obviously, so obviously today. When I wrote some of these guides a few years ago, the big challenge was the pandemic. Now we have, escalating conflict, which is terrible. And these are great challenges to peace, and they're great challenges to sustainable development. Sustainable development is how we work to achieve these things over time. So when we talk about sustainability, it can be a bit vague, it can be a bit difficult, it means different things to different people, but sustainable development is a bit different. It's what we do, it's the action. And so if we think in terms of peace, in terms of sustainable development, we might think about it in terms of, well, how do we educate people for a culture of peace? That would relate to Sustainable Development Goal 4 on quality education. How do we reduce inequalities? How do we promote sustainable cities and communities where everyone can live together in harmony? How do we promote peace, justice and strong institutions, Goal 16? And how do we promote partnerships? And if I just pick on Goal 16 there, peace, justice and strong institutions, if we think about the opposite, is conflict, injustice and weak institutions. So we also need strong institutions in terms of the cultural sector understanding what its role is, what its responsibilities are, but also what its limits are, so that it doesn't do things that, let's say, that it perhaps shouldn't do, that it is too instrumental, that it tries to persuade people of particular things that get in the way of people either expressing their own views or so on. And so let's look at Latvia from a sustainable development perspective. So this is I hope you can see it a bit. This is a different way of looking at the goals. Rather than the nice 17 different colours, this is done as a traffic light system. And so this is produced every year in a report called the SDG. It's called the SDG Index. It's not done by the official SDG by the UN, but to say there are 17 goals, and I'll just highlight that there are 2, 4, 6 for which there are major challenges in Latvia. There are 4 for which there are significant challenges, and so on. And so that the only one that is actually on track to be met by 2030 is Goal 15, which is about preserving nature on land. That's really great news. But what you can think about, and just to say here as well, is that out of all of the 163 countries that have done their kind of scoring for this, Latvia if you want to play that kind of game, it comes 14th. But it has to be said, no country is even close to being all green, not even by a mile. So having any greens is a great thing. But this is actually, I hope, a piece of information that can be useful for the cultural sector. What are the challenges that there are in Latvia? Which ones are getting better? Which ones are getting worse? And what can you do to help address them? And people are often very interested in these things, in the reds, yellows and greens, and we can talk about them afterwards as well. But anyone can see this. It's called the SDG Index. It's a great thing. It comes out around about every June, and you can see the profile for every country. And so how do we work with the Sustainable Development Goals? We're probably not ever going to possibly go into a museum or library and it just says, you know, here are 17 goals and this is how Latvia is doing, and it's red, yellow and green. What we do is we take the principles of the goals and we apply them to our own sector. And so this is what we call localizing, like the conference that Inga and Zane and others organized last year. How do we localize the agenda to the cultural sector? And so I personally think this framework works very well. That we can think about this as kind of 7 big opportunities for the cultural sector to support sustainable development. How it helps protect and safeguard cultural and natural heritage. How it promotes education for sustainable development. How it promotes cultural participation for everyone, which, as I mentioned before, is a human right. How we support sustainable tourism, and of course this is something that relates very much to the World Heritage Convention, 50 years old this year. How do we ensure that World Heritage is used or developed in sustainable ways, and in ways that contribute positively to economies and communities, while at the same time protecting and safeguarding the cultural and natural heritage? How do we support research for sustainable development, you know, using our fantastic collections? How do we make sustainable development everybody's work every day? Every time you buy something, every time you hire someone, every time you decide who gets a promotion, every time you throw something away, every time you make an exhibition, every time you switch on a light switch, every time you use energy, all of these things can be options for a better future or a worse one. And how do we use our great, you know, the potential of cultural institutions to build bridges, as I mentioned before, culture-based peace building. Building bridges between different sectors, between people, between society. So for instance, I'll just make one up. How could we use a place like this for people to be involved in urban planning decisions in the World Heritage Site? That could be a great, I'm not sure, possibly you do it already, I'm not sure. How can people know about what the developments are and have opportunities to share their views, or to understand why particular aspects of culture and heritage are protected, to consider, well, what do culture and heritage mean to them, and so on. And then just to say, there are many, many ways that the cultural sector can contribute to sustainable development. I've just got some images here from things we've been involved in over the last few years. There were some webinars that I did back in 2020. We had the Ask Your Library, Ask Your Museum initiative, 2 conferences. Through the Zoom time, we even had to learn this slightly bizarre 3D world, 3D virtual world, because we couldn't meet in person. And we had, most fantastically, I think, is Latvia's report to the United Nations. So Latvia's official national report on how it's working to progress sustainable development. And this was wonderful because by a long story and by a lot of work, I think especially by Inga and her colleagues, the value of museums, libraries and cultural participation is all over the report. And this is fantastic because it's done in such a way that it recognises that role or that aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals. That it's not just a top-down approach, it's a bottom-up approach as well. It's about all of society, you know, sharing its ideas, you know, looking at local challenges and so on. And this was fantastic. And I think in the report it talks about 3 accelerators, 3 ways to speed up activity for sustainable development. And one of them was the role of the cultural sector, cultural institutions. And we had an event I think it was in July, about the role of museums and libraries in the age of unreliable information and cultural conflict. And this was fantastic. And then the last of these 3 sides of the triangle that I want to talk about is called disaster risk reduction, which is a slightly scary sounding title, but it's about building resilience. And we heard before that one of the priorities for the World Heritage Convention is around resilience. And so I wrote this guide to say, well, what do we mean by resilience? It means there are very good processes for building resilience. And so the guide is about disaster risk reduction, building resilience in museums, society, and in nature. So this one was written around museums, but it can apply to any part of the cultural sector, I think. And just to explain what it includes, it talks about the different parts of what make up risk, who is affected by risk, and how we can look at reducing disaster risk in an ongoing way, also how we get through disasters, and also how we come out the other side stronger, that we don't just try to recreate what we were doing before, because that just puts us back in the same position. That's hopeless. And so there are many actions that we can take to reduce disaster risk. Protecting the environment, avoiding exploitation of people or nature, reducing poverty and inequality, how we can plan our towns and cities for peace, and how we can strengthen our partnerships and strengthen decision-making and trust between different parts of society. And so the easiest way to think about this, I find, it's a bit like a mathematical equation. So disaster risk is not the same as what a hazard is. So if you live next to a great big river, the river is not the risk. The river is the hazard. The risk is made up of something more complicated than that. And just to explain this. So the hazards are what the threats are. The exposure is who is more or less exposed to that threat. And the vulnerability is how sensitive different kinds of people or groups of people or nature are to those hazards. I'll explain that afterwards. And then below that, we try to strengthen our capacities, which is all of our knowledge, our wisdom, our ideas, our solutions, which give us our resilience. The resilience is the output of our capacity. And so these are what make up disaster risk. And so what we are trying to do is to minimize what is on the top and maximize what is on the bottom. I hope this makes sense. So I'll give you an example. So outside my hotel this morning, there's a great big river. There's the trams, and then there is a great big river. And there is the big indoor market. So we could say that the river can present a hazard because it can flood. We can say that there are buildings that are closer to the river or farther away. The ones which are closer to it are more exposed to any flood from the river. And we might say that there are buildings which are quite strong, modern, flood-proof. Those have a lower vulnerability than perhaps old wooden ones or ones in a poor condition, and so on. But the capacity would be, well, what is the experience of the different sectors to work together, their knowledge of past disasters, what the lessons learnt, and so on. And that is what gives us our resilience. And so the disaster risk is a measure of all of these things. What we're trying to do is not eliminate, get rid of disaster risk, because that's impossible. But what we're trying to do is to reduce it to a manageable level. And the reason that I mention this is because it's very closely tied to sustainable development. So you can think that sustainable development is the other way around. We try to strengthen all of our capacities and our resilience. We try to reduce the hazards, the exposure, and vulnerability. So they're basically the same thing. So I hope this makes sense. Sustainable development and disaster risk reduction are very closely tied together. So we can say that disaster risk reduction is found really across all of the 17 goals, but there are 2 targets in particular that focus in on it. Both of them are in the goal on sustainable cities and communities. How do we reduce the effects of natural disasters is SDG 11.5. And how do we develop policies and plans that aren't just about disaster risk reduction, but about inclusion, resource efficiency, and disaster risk reduction. This is what we're trying to do today. We're looking at how we can use our cultural institutions to manage and reduce disaster risk. That's what I think we're here to do today. So let's think again about this. That the hazards are hard to change, if not impossible to change. It's going to be impossible to move the river. The exposure can be also very hard to change. Not everyone can move away from the river. The vulnerability is the easiest one to change. So how do we do this? We do it either through social methods, such as education, raising awareness, helping build people's confidence and their skills of how they and their property can survive any disaster. We might think about changing the buildings so that they are strong in the face of disasters. This is a particular challenge with old buildings, of course, but also planning or policy options. And so the guide explains disaster risk reduction as a concept, as an idea, and it takes something called the 10 essentials of resilience, which is something that is used internationally in cities to try to plan for urban resilience. Because many museums are in towns and cities, I thought, well, why not take the 10 essentials and see how museums and cultural institutions can contribute towards them. And what it aims to be is a kind of practical framework, I hope, for you to understand disaster risk, but also to take part very actively in disaster risk reduction, and also to show what museums and so on have to offer. And so this guide had really two main goals: to help museums and other cultural institutions to build their own resilience and reduce the impact of disasters that they might face. But the other one is to kind of unlock the potential of cultural institutions to contribute to building stronger, more peaceful, better societies and places to live. And so I'll show you a page just to show how it works. That it takes the 10 essentials and gives you these 7 activities from the Museums and SDGs guide. I really don't expect anyone to be able to read this. You can see it on the PDF. So I'll just go through the 10 essentials very quickly, because they're really simple and you can use them in a very practical way. So the first one is to get organised. Who else is working on disaster risk reduction, or who else could work in this? Who are the different sectors? What are your relationships? How can you strengthen your relationships with them? The second one is to understand, well, what are the risks that what are the disaster risks that we face, both now and in the future. We might think about it in terms of urban planning, or climate change, or conflict, or any of a number of things. What are the sources of risk now and in the future? What are our opportunities to put some money towards building resilience? How can we make sure that resilience isn't thought of like as a project, that there's all the things you do and resilience is like one that sits at the side? How can we make sure that all of our planning processes and decisions and our budgeting are aware of disaster risk and our opportunities to reduce it? The fourth one, again, very relevant in the context of a World Heritage site, about how can we develop well-planned towns and places, and how can we involve people in the process for strong and peaceful communities. This could be great. The fifth one, around supporting nature, strengthening nature to help us, but also to protect nature, because of course it is natural heritage. It has value of itself. The sixth one, to make sure that our institutions are strong. For instance, they have some money for what we would call a rainy day. They have emergency support if a crisis comes along. Because if we think that, well, museums and, museums in particular are kind of long-term institutions, you know, if we think they have material from sometimes millions of years ago, but they often don't have much of a plan for the future. So how can we have a plan for the next 100 years? You know, where would a collection be in 100 years? To make sure that museums and other cultural institutions are robust as a structure in society. And then the seventh one is about public education and awareness, strengthening everyone's resilience through whether it's education or awareness raising and information programs, because everyone has a right to know the challenges that they or their property face, but in reality, people often don't know this. I don't know quite why, but that's the case. And how we can make sure that the different structures that we will need in the time of an emergency are strong. Obvious ones would be the roads or the communications for times of disaster. And we might think, well, what's this got to do with cultural institutions? Because they wouldn't be thought of often as a essential infrastructure. I hope that word makes sense. But in emergency, so I'll give you some examples. So when there was a big fire in California, there is one of the Getty museums has been developed to be very safe in the event of a fire, because it was planned that way. So the museum was used as the headquarters by the firemen because it was the safest building in the area. So we can think about, well, if there was to be an emergency situation, how could a place like this, you know, often they're quite big buildings, they might have empty rooms, how can they support the emergency services? Then, I'm nearly finished. The ninth one, how can we make sure that you have plans in place for a time of disaster, so that when the disaster hits, you can think, okay, here's the plan, let's do it. Because if there's no plan, it's not going to be so likely that you're going to get through it so well. And the last one is, how do we use the opportunity for it's called Build Back Better, which is a nice phrase. Sometimes people use it in different ways. All it means is that we don't try to just go back to what we were doing before, because the disaster only highlighted our weakness. We have to make sure that we think, okay, well, what got us in that situation? How can we make sure we don't end up in it again? So just as to summarize, well, we have the need, because disasters are, you know, they happen, they're here. But we have the tools. You know, these tools exist in the shape of these different processes. They might not be so much the work of how the cultural sector works, but they exist. Why not make use of them? So we just need to use them. So on International Disaster Risk Reduction Day, I'd just like to think that hopefully I've got across that this is something that is relevant to our work, that we can contribute positively to society, and we can also benefit in the process. So thank you very much.